I feel like a bit of a fraud here because I'm just a lawyer. I'm not a technical expert. And so what I want to share with you is some of the things that I've done in the course of my work. And I've been privileged to do it and work with some great people. So the first slide is, this is me. So I'm a barrister, also managing partner of a law firm in London, and also Quantum Resilience, which is a company which I've started with a bunch of other people, which I think we're launching today somewhere. So that's me. These are the three things I'd like to speak to you about. What did I learn from prosecuting serious cybercrime cases? Are cybercrime laws fit for purpose now? And then, do I have any suggestions? Now, when I started as a barrister, well, I became a barrister the same year the Computer Misuse Act was born, so you can work that out for yourself. When I started, no one had a personal computer. The internet was the stuff of science fiction, and barristers, and some still do, just use pen and paper, but everyone did back then. And my pupil master told me, look, Sandip, there are three types of people. They're bad, mad, and sad. And I thought, well, really? Is that it? And he said, yes, that's it. They all fall into one of those three categories. Now, when I came to deal with cybercrime many, many years later, I found that there was a fourth category, the curious. And one of the chaps I'm going to speak to you about, and I'll, in due course, it's a fascinating case of curiosity rather than criminality. And but we all know that the threat of cybercrime, the nature of the beast, is that it's transnational, it's virtual, it's transient and ever-changing. And so again, when I started as barrister, a criminal would put on a balaclava, arm with themselves with a shotgun and go to the local bank, and that was called a bank robbery. Sadly, the internet, well, sadly for barristers, the internet has put that to history, because I don't think anyone robs a bank in that same way anymore. And it's just a classic example of technology making what humans do redundant. And so rather like horse-drawn carriages, I don't think anyone has those anymore. And so the reality of cybercrime, as I've discovered, is that this is the golden age for criminals. I read a stat the other day, I don't know if it's true, we all read these stats. Cybercrime costs the world $10 trillion a year. That's a huge amount of money. Now, that was a loss which was not there when I started as a barrister. And then I read another stat that Ukraine has cost $2.4 trillion to the world economy. And you think, wow, put those next to each other. Those are startling figures, especially in the case of cybercrime. So, let me introduce you to. Now, I'm going to show you a series of photographs. I don't think there'll be any more reading from me, so unlike a barrister who likes to be paid by the word, this will just be pictures that I'm going to show you. Now, I don't know if you recognize this man. It's Rennie Subramaniam, a.k.a. Jilcy. Now, some years ago, he was the administrator for Dark Market, which is the precursor for Silk Road. Now, Dark Market at the time was the online forum, Facebook, Alibaba place for criminals. You could meet, greet, get to know each other, share ideas about how to better commit crime, buy and sell guns, drugs, whatever you want to do. And it was run by Rennie Subramaniam from an internet cafe in North London. That's where he worked. That was his office. He was known as Jilcy online, and online he was a god to all that followed him. Obviously, they didn't know this was the real person in real life. And I got to prosecute him eventually through campaign involving the CIA, FBI, and the Serious and Organised Crime Agency, because he was operating from a cafe in North London, and the Americans were able to identify where he was working from, and then there was a police investigation, and then a traditional surveillance, and the police saw this man. And he would be there at the computer all day, sometimes night, if it was open, and we managed to arrest him. He was a remarkable young man because, as I say, online he was a god, but in real life I discovered more about him through Misha Glenny's book, Dark Market, that he had a drug habit, he was a bit of a loner, and a misfit. We couldn't find any money he made, or he seemed to just administrate Dark Market because that was his reason for living, really. But a fascinating chap. Now, anyone recognize this young man? Okay, I'm going to show you some photographs, and if you do recognize it, just say so, and I think the organizers will gift you a bottle of champagne. This is Seth Nolan McDonough. Now, we've already heard from Carl about the stereotype of the cyber criminal. Now, Seth started his criminal career at the age of 14, from his bedroom, obviously, and quite a clever chap. So in the course of the next 2 years, he built up a botnet of 28,000 computers. And then he sold his services online to Russians, predominantly Russians, because Russians used his abilities to attack their competitors in Russia. And he made quite a good living out of it. We discovered that he had a couple of bank accounts in the UK, and he also had some cryptocurrency accounts, Bitcoin accounts, and so forth. But in a good month, he could make £20,000 to £30,000. Now, what happened was that he carried out a DDoS attack against Spam House projects, which you're probably familiar with. And in remediation, what happened was that the internet exchanges became overloaded in Europe and around the world. And as a consequence of which, the Washington Post said, "This is the boy who broke the internet." Now, when the police went to arrest him, which it was easy because he was using the IP address in the name of his mother, so it was not very difficult, the family internet service. And so the police went, and obviously there's a knock on the door, and they said, "Look, we're here for you, for Seth." So they knew it was, and they said, mother said, "Why? What's he been up to?" And they said, "Well, you know, he's been doing this cybercrime and etc., and he almost broke the internet." And they explained to her, "Look, he's been working for the Russians and so forth and making quite a lot of money." And the mother said, "Wait till I get my hands on the bleeder. I've been paying for his Russian lessons." And I mean, Seth was quite a remarkable guy because he was on the spectrum, like a lot of them are. And he really didn't think that he was doing anything wrong, but he certainly was. And so his criminal activity, his career ended at the age of 16, I think. I think the last I heard is that he went to university and he's put crime behind him. But a fascinating guy. Jake Davis, a.k.a. Topiary. He was instrumental in anonymous activists' campaigns, payback against Sony, FBI, CIA. They attacked anyone they could. And they were pretty prominent some years ago with the Guido Fawkes mask as their sort of slogan and so forth. Now, Jake was about 17. He was abandoned by his family in the Shetland Islands. And so what he did was just administer the campaigns for anonymous LulzSec all day and night. Now, he was eventually identified through this was a really good campaign. It involved 26 jurisdictions, number of law enforcement, and so forth, and not easy to do, and very rare to do that, as Carl has mentioned. And so police, Serious Organised Crime Agency, identified him, and when Seth was later arrested, and he said that was the best day of my life, because he was on his own, abandoned, he fended for himself. And Serious Organised Crime Agency, because it was in Scotland, had a private jet fly up there, pick up Seth, and fly him back. And it was just his own jet. He was on his own. And he'd never flown before. And he thought this was fantastic. This is great. Now, Jake Davis is now on the lecture circuit. And Google him, please. He's a fascinating guy. And he will say to you, look, if it's smart, it's vulnerable. And he can demonstrate, if you've got a smart fridge, he can hack that and hack into your network. And say, he doesn't do it anymore, but have a look at his YouTube. It's really, really fascinating. Right, the last one. Anyone recognize this one? Glenn Mangum. This is the young man who stole Facebook's source code just before their $150 billion flotation. And he did it again from his bedroom in North England. And what happened was, one Monday morning, Facebook technician was going through the servers and thought, well, there's something odd here. There's something which shouldn't be here in the code. And so they looked into it and thought, no, this is an alien code here. This is not ours. Now, Glenn at the time realized the game was up. So as the Facebook technicians were trying to backtrack, see where this code had come from, Glenn was feverishly erasing his digital footprints. What happened was that Glenn, there was something called Puzzle Server. I don't know if it's still there or not. It's a challenge. And if you pass this puzzle, you can apply for a job at Facebook. And what Glenn found was not only could he solve the puzzle, that was easy for him, but he found a vulnerability. And he was managed to exploit that vulnerability through the external server and then get into the internal servers. He then hijacked a Facebook employee's email account who happened to be away on holiday for 6 weeks and impersonated that person. And that person was in the administrative side. And so was able to then impersonate that person, say, well, can you just give me the codes for X, Y, and Z and the privileged access rights for X, Y, and Z, which they did. And then consequently, Glenn was able to access the internal servers and download the source code in his bedroom. Now, the American authorities thought, well, only the Chinese could be capable of doing this. They had no idea it was going to be just young Glenn. So they thought it was industrial espionage. And eventually, we were able to identify it was Glenn, again, through very simple means. And then there was a battle, because the district attorney in Silicon Valley said, no, we're going to make an example of Glenn. We're going to get, and he was going to get 80 years in a federal penitentiary or something like that. Thankfully, we didn't want another McKinnon situation, so we battled hard with them and said, no, he's UK citizen, committed the crime here, we've got the evidence, well, some of the evidence, and we can deal with him here. And eventually, the American authorities said, all right, we weren't going to send him, and we weren't going to accede to an extradition. That would have been wholly wrong. So the reason why Glenn was he was curious, as I said. He fell into that fourth category. He did it for the intellectual challenge. Previously, he had hacked Yahoo, told them, and then Yahoo paid him a bounty bug to try and do it again. He was that good. And so he could have sold what he had for vast amounts of money, because at the time the Chinese were trying to develop their own equivalent of Facebook. You could just hand it on a plate. So when he was arrested and questioned, he explained to the officers how he went about it, and they were scratching their heads and saying, "Oh, we don't understand this really." So they brought some experts in, and Glenn effectively mentored them and taught them how he did what he did. Now, again, he was on the spectrum, couldn't lie, so he just admitted to everything and what he did. But we had to prosecute him because he'd committed a crime under the Computer Misuse Act. Now, one may say he's an ethical hacker and so should not be prosecuted, but that's another conversation I'll come to. But he received a prison sentence of 8 months, and so he appealed that. And I remember being in the Court of Appeal in front of their lordships and trying to explain what source code meant. Now, being just a barrister, you know, and I think I should add that Facebook were wholly uncooperative. They refused to acknowledge that Glenn had stolen the source code. They said it was very important material. We said, well, can't you go further than that? No. And so what we had to do was deal with this all in private, behind closed doors, and all sealed letters with the judge. And eventually, unfortunately, Glenn's barrister blurted out, "It's the source code." And so anyway, the cat was out of the bag. But Facebook did not want to cooperate at all. I think they were hugely embarrassed by it all. So I was asked, Mr. Patel, what is a source code? And I said, well, crown jewels? No, that doesn't really cut it, Mr. Patel. Coca-Cola recipe, my lord, is that cut? No, and I wasn't getting anywhere with the court. And the thought crossed my mind, you know, Colonel Sanders, KFC, but thankfully I didn't mention that. I didn't need to. I think they got it at the end of the day, that it was critical to the existence of Facebook. Now, Glenn, I think he is now working on the good side. I think he's working for the authorities. I hope he is, because he should be. But fascinating case. Now, Computer Misuse Act. What can we say about that? It's, 32 years old now? Created at a time when what we were dealing with, voice systems, and not intended for the age that we are now living in. And I don't know if you have views on the Act at all, we've had any experiences with it, but when we were prosecuting the case, this is what I felt like we were using. These are sort of Stone Age or medieval tools, legal tools to deal with modern crime. Not only in terms of investigation, but actually the rules of evidence, admissibility, and Carl's touched upon this, just geography, trying to deal with multiple law enforcements. And so the transnational nature of crime means that effectively we're still using these tools to a certain extent with the Computer Misuse Act. And the reality is, although I've been involved in prosecuting these cases, they're exceptional. A lot of resources are expended on them for what? And it's rather like whack-a-mole. You know, the game where you hit one and another one pops up, hit one, and that's effectively what it is. And so law enforcement has its role, but it's not going to be decisive in dealing with cybercrime. And that's why it's important that those who practice in the industry, you guys, you people, are the ones who are going to have the most impact on cybercrime, not law enforcement. How am I doing for time?
Couple of minutes.
Couple of minutes, all right. Okay. Right, picture the UN. Now, cyber rules are made to be broken. In my view, the UN is not an appropriate forum for dealing with cybercrime and its transnational nature. China, Russia will only drag out those discussions. 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping and President Obama made a famous agreement not to use cyber espionage for commercial advantage. That agreement lasted about 12 months, as we know. The Budapest Convention, if anyone knows that, 2001, it's the closest we've ever come to an international instrument for dealing with cybercrime. But again, it's got nowhere, really. Although Russia at the time was its chief advocate, it's still a non-signatory to it. And so the reality is that there's going to be no expectation, no reality of international cooperation. So then the responsibility breaks down to governments, individual governments, and the private sector. Solutions. This is interesting because, in my view, all roads lead to Rome. And the solutions are, as I say, in the hands of the people who actually practice in cybercrime. Because the internet is just a network of networks, and the most networks are controlled in the private sector and not by governments. And so it's my view that it's a responsibility of those who are in charge of the networks to safeguard them, and if everyone does that, then the internet and the virtual world becomes much safer. I'll just leave this comment with you. The mayor of Fadai, in the 1960s, he built a seawall because some 40 years before there was a tsunami which engulfed the town. At the time, he was criticized for building this seawall. It was a huge expense, $20 million, the equivalent of now. And he was very unpopular, and he was voted out. 40 years later, in 2011, the tsunami came, and the seawall protected Fadai. Every other place was overwhelmed and damaged. By that stage, the mayor had died, but people leave flowers on his grave as a result of that. And why do I tell you about that? I hope the message is simple. It's the fact that it's the preparation which is all important. And so when I'm asked by boards, why am I doing this? Why am I spending this money? I can't see it. I can't, how can I value it? Well, I always sort of say, well, just think about the mayor of Fadai, all right? At the time, it was not visible, but 40 years later, it saved the town. And I think that's I find that a very useful analogy when I'm dealing with people who say, is it worth it?
Sandip, super.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.